The Story of Dandi March, written by Sandhya, illustrated by Ranjan Day. In 1857, Indians fought the first war of independence against the British. They were brave, but were defeated. Nearly 75 years later, Indians fought a very different kind of battle, and won. Their leader was Mahatma Gandhi. All he said was, "Give us our salt." On January 31st, 1930, Gandhi found himself writing a letter to the Viceroy, Lord Irwin. The Viceroy was the British monarch's representative in India. "Dear friend," Gandhi began. He was always polite, even to people he did not agree with. He was writing on behalf of the Indian people. He pointed out many unjust things the British were doing. One of them concerned salt. Salt, as you know, comes from seawater. Since India is surrounded by seas on 3 sides, salt is easily available. Even the poorest persons who cannot afford anything else can make their food tasty by adding salt to it. But the British had their own ideas. They took control of all the salt factories and salt pans in the country. Indians could no longer make their own salt. They were forced to buy from the British. Not only that, they also had to pay tax, i.e., they had to give the British extra money over and above the price of salt. This made them very angry. Next to air and water, salt was the greatest necessity of life, especially for the poor. So Gandhi drew up a clever plan. It was a plan that would help the people fight all the unfair things the British were doing in India. He told Irwin exactly what he was going to do. He said that if the Viceroy did not accept the 11 demands that he had made in his letter, he would break the salt law and encourage all Indians to do the same. How Gandhi and his followers went from Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad to Dandi. How would he break the salt law? By walking all the way from Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad, where he lived, to a small coastal town called Dandi, 384 kilometers away. There, the Arabian Sea left large deposits of salt crystals on the shore. Gandhi said he would pick up a lump of salt to show the world that Indians would make their own salt and sell it. Indians would not pay the unfair salt tax. Indians would not pay any unfair tax. The salt satyagraha was just the beginning. Do what you want, thought Irwin. I will not change one law set down by my government. On March 12, 1930, everyone at the ashram awoke early. They bathed, prayed, and gathered around Gandhi. He talked to them for a few minutes, and then he and 78 others set out. Each one carried a hola with only the most essential items needed for the journey. This was the Dandi March. The marchers set out from the ashram. Gandhi was 61 years old, but he walked very fast. The others had to run to keep pace with him. The British government knew Gandhi was going to break the salt law. Why did they not stop him? "Oh," Irwin said, "Mr. Gandhi will never get that far. He will collapse in a heap long before he reaches Dandi. In fact, the British seemed to think the whole idea was a joke." Some Indians, too, laughed at Gandhi. Mrs. S. Nadeau, poet and close friend of Gandhi, once said in a speech how she, too, laughed. "How will this little man fight the most powerful empire in the world?" she asked and laughed. Gandhi did not care. He and his 78 just continued walking. They had drawn up a hectic schedule. Once they set out early in the morning, they halted only a few times. They had to reach a particular place by nightfall each day. In towns and villages, people greeted them with great excitement. Flower garlands and streamers decorated the villages. Children sat perched on treetops competing with each other to see who would be the first to spot the marchers. "I see them! I see them!" a child would scream and run to tell the elders. Sometimes the party would stop for a rest or refreshments. Gandhi would advise the people to be clean and to do their duty. At other times, he would write letters or he would spin. He was never idle. A village all dressed up to greet Gandhi. It was a very tiring journey, and some volunteers got milk, oranges, and grapes from nearby towns. Gandhi scolded them. He felt that each one had to face up to all hardships. Didn't poor people live like that? Sometimes villagers sat quietly outside their homes, spinning as the marchers went past. Sometimes men, women, and children sang bhajans. The volunteers joined in. In one village, Gandhi made an appeal to the people. "Give up your government jobs," he said. Remember, the government at that time was the British government. Immediately, 300 young officials resigned from their posts. Just like that. In another little village called Degam, a 105-year-old woman was waiting anxiously. As soon as the group arrived, she went to Gandhi and bowed before him. Then she put a big red tilak on his forehead and said, "Go now, and bring self-rule back with you." Newspaper reporters and radio correspondents were moved by the Dandi March. They reached news of the marches every day to all corners of India and the world. Halfway through the march, the volunteers had to cross the Mahi River, but when they reached it, they found it was too deep to wade across. Twilight had fallen. What would they do? Gandhi led them along the river to another point where the river was more shallow. By then, it was 10 p.m. Through knee-deep water and slush, the volunteers stumbled and slipped in the dark. At last, after 2.5 hours, they were on the other side, crossing the Mahi River. The marchers reached Dandi on April 5th. It was late evening. The birds had all gone home. The volunteers were hot and dusty. Early next morning, after bath and prayers, Gandhi walked into the waters of the Arabian Sea. He bent down and picked up a lump of salt. The volunteers and all those who had gathered there cheered loudly. "Mahatma Gandhi, Ki Hali!" someone shouted. "Vande Mataram!" Everyone joined in. Gandhi had broken the salt law. This was a signal to the people of India. C. Rajaji led a group from Trichy to Vedraniam on the east coast off the Bay of Bengal Cay. Kalepan walked from Calicut to Povanar on the west coast. Satyagrahi walked all the way from Sylhet and Assam to Nakali on the Bengal coast. Elsewhere, everywhere, people made salt in pots and pans. In Allahabad and Delhi, in Calcutta, in Gansoli, in Chittagong, in the smallest village. Boldly, openly, the people of India challenged the British government. Gandhi picks up a lump of salt from the Arabian Sea and breaks the law. Government responded with force. They realized too late that Indians were using salt to take on the military might of the British. On April 11th, more than 200 policemen and officers swooped down on Satyagrahi in Bombay. Women volunteers barred their way, but they were pushed aside. The others formed a ring around the salt pans. They too were pushed aside and the salt pans destroyed. Nearly 5,000 people watched as the Satyagrahi were arrested and taken away in vans. Cries of "Gandhi Kai Hai," "Down with the Union Jack," Hindu-Muslim Kai Hai filled the air. It was the same story all over India. No matter how many salt pans the police destroyed, more came up. No matter how many people they arrested, more appeared. Thousands of women joined the movement. They stood outside liquor shops and shops selling foreign cloth, appealing to the people not to buy these things. When the British commanding officers ordered soldiers of the Garhwal Rifles to fire on demonstrators in Peshawar, they refused to do so. The civil disobedience movement had begun. Boycott foreign goods. Buy only Swadeshi. The most heroic incident took place a few days later. Gandhi was in Karadi, about 5 kilometers from Dandi. He informed the viceroy that he and a group of 2,500 Satyagrahi were going to march on the salt factory at Dharasana. 3 days later, on May 4th, as Gandhi was sleeping on a string cot under a mango tree, he was suddenly woken up. A bright light was shining in his eyes. "You are under arrest," he was told by the district magistrate of Surat. He was accompanied by 2 police officers armed with pistols and 30 constables carrying rifles. It was the middle of the night. Gandhi was taken away and locked up in Yervada prison Pune. Mrs. Naidu took over. "Remember Gandhi's words," she said. "No violence." The Satyagrahi reached the factory on May 21st. It was being guarded by 400 Surat police, a few English officers, and 25 riflemen. The first row walked up to the factory. The police began to hit them with steel-tipped wooden clubs. Many fell down, bleeding. The next row walked forward. They were 2 clubbed down, then the next line, and the next, and the next. All of them went down silently. Only the sound of clubs on heads could be heard. The injured were carried away on stretchers by volunteers. When all 2,500 had gone down, 2 lay dead, 320 were injured. Reporters reached the story of British brutality and the heroism of nonviolent action to the whole world. Incident at Dharasana Salt Works. Nearly 1 year later, on March 5, 1931, the Gandhi-Irwin Pact was signed. The British gave in to many Indian demands. Most important, there was to be no more tax on salt. Indians could make their own salt. How did Gandhi manage to win this big victory? As he himself explained, supposing 10 persons in each of the 700,000 villages in India come forward to manufacture salt and to disobey the Salt Act. What do you think the government can do? Nothing. What guns and soldiers could not do, Gandhi did, quietly and simply. He showed the most effective way to challenge British power. The people of India responded to the call bravely and unitedly. A British cartoonist called David Lowe drew this picture of Gandhi breaking the salt law. If you enjoyed this production of Dandi March, please like the video and subscribe for more. Thank you to those who have watched this video, and remember, you are highly appreciated.